Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's talk, Drawings from Raje, the Patient Search for Architecture. Anant Raje was a well-known architect, intellectual, and teacher. He graduated from the JJ School of Fine Arts in Mumbai in 1954. He started his architecture studio in Ahmedabad in 1969 after returning from Philadelphia, where he worked with Louis Kahn. Raje was an architect's architect. In describing his practice of 4 decades, the former director of School of Architecture in SEPT, Ahmedabad, Professor Waki wrote, and I quote, "Raje's work exhibits integrity between purpose and expression, building and landscape, part and whole, and the ultimate quality of all good architecture through time, a sense of repose. If the disciplines of the mind are the underpinnings of all his work, it is his excellent understanding of the elements of building, the laws of construct, that give it the sense of ordered presence. Yet it is an order enriched by the patina of materials he chooses and his sensitivity of light. There is in it a softness and quality of transcendence. Raje knows better than most the essence of history and its continued presence. Raje's association with the School of Architecture at SEPT in Ahmedabad was consistent throughout his period of practice. He was Professor Emeritus. He was also the director in the 1980s. He also taught at the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad and at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. He was invited as a visiting professor at universities around the world. Raje was a recipient of many awards, both professional and academic. I would like to also use the opportunity to acknowledge the presence of Amita Raje this evening amongst us. Amita was a long-standing associate of Raje over the 40 years of his practice. Her strong sense of geometry and geometric order in architecture was something Raje deeply appreciated. She was integral to many of his projects. And now I would like to introduce you to the speaker for the evening, who also happens to be a dear friend. Shubhra Raje. Her practice involves designing buildings and teaching architecture, working in environments that engage diverse issues, multiple constituencies, and varying scales, from interiors to architecture, creative urbanism to conservation. With graduate and postgraduate degrees in architecture and a minor in theory and criticism from Cornell and SEPT, Shubhra founded her studio, Shubhra Raje Built Environments, that concerns itself with relevant design, architectural economy, and spatial ecology. Shubhra is a visiting professor of architecture at the Center for Environmental Planning and Technology in Ahmedabad and the Denver and Boulder campuses of the University of Colorado. She is a founding member of the Anant Raje Foundation that's hosting the exhibition here at BIC and this talk this evening. The foundation was created by Shubhra and Amita Raje as a platform to support cross-disciplinary initiatives in the fields of art, architecture, and the built environment. And with that, I'll hand over the podium to Shubhra.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you, Susmita. Thank you also especially to Raghu and Ravi and the entire BIC team, to Soumitro. A tremendous support in Bangalore. We are so privileged. Thanks also especially to my Ahmedabad team, especially Harsh Bhavsar and Kanksha Shah. Unfortunately, they had to return to Ahmedabad, so they are not here, and they are very deeply missed. I'm going to start right away, but just as by way of a little bit of background and context, I did not work with my father. I did have the privilege to be his student, as well as assisted him in a couple of his studios. And so, since his passing, his drawings really and his photographs and his work in the archives at UPenn have been a way to sort of continue my conversation with him and also get to know him a little bit, a side of him that I didn't know very well. And it's truly a privilege to be able to share some of these conversations. So it's in that spirit both the exhibition and this talk should be taken. So beginnings in terms of the developmental origins of a work, something that engages the vital and intangible relationships of context and the fundamental of circumstance surrounding each particular work. First questions and encounters. Raje often began a semester speaking of the site and introductions to the students thus, and I quote, "Every time you encounter a tree, you encounter a shadow. The largeness of the shadow generates a sense of shelter. Therefore, when we talk about shelter, we associate it with the shadow. And so shadow and shelter are synonymous. Shadows bring with them the smallest blocks of context, the sun, air, and the ground. Together they generate it, give it character and a position. A building is rooted in the soil on which it sits, as Charles Correa used to often say, representing that part of the truth that belongs to architecture. So the idea of shelter thus begins with the substance of context before the design of organizational space and space for the sake of form. Now I'll start with this project. It was done in 1991 by Raje for a very close family friend in Ahmedabad, the Shodhans, at their Shodhan villa. It is a structure where, during weddings, the family of the bride receives the groom and his entourage, that sort of Bharat thing. Raje locates the structure in the shade of an existing mango tree, as you see here, the tree making the roof and the canopy. To accommodate itself with the aesthetic vocabulary of Platonic solids of the Shodhan house, to the cube, Raje brings a cylinder. This is the site plan. You see the Shodhan house there, and the wedding wall, as it was fondly called, is at the bend of the driveway under the mango tree. Some developmental sketches where the genesis of the idea can be noticed. So it is a cylinder which is in two parts, asymmetrical, and made with sun-dried bricks on an existing concrete pad or a driveway. That is the plan. The stability is provided by the shape of the walls, shape of the cylinder, as well as the wall's sectional profile, which has a sense of foundations that have literally emerged from the ground. The walls themselves required no foundations, given that the existing concrete driveway was strong enough, and the relative lightness of the structure and the absence of a constructed roof. In other words, a form informed by its structure and its making, in addition to its association in the larger context of the main house. The walls are finished by mud plaster and accentuated by abhlas, which in Gujarat especially is this mirror work that you find all along North Gujarat and Kutch, both in clothing and in homes, etc. The finishing, though, became the part of the occasion. Raje took a step back to allow the wall to become part of the larger wedding preparations and all the socialization that is part of such preparations. The family and the friends participated in this phase of plastering and finishing, accompanied by wedding stories and songs, many selected by the bride herself, and of course, a lot of gossip and laughter. There was this wonderful confluence of making with the occasion. On the wedding day, everything is resplendent, lamps, flowers, color, etc., etc. After the wedding was done, the walls came down the following monsoon. They just literally got washed away. The driveway was washed and life in the household returned to its everyday rhythms and routines. I begin with this project because although in its materiality it is an exception in Raje's oeuvre, and it is also not chronologically an early work, in it are clues for us to understand an aspect of Raje's architecture which is not often discussed, I feel, and also the locus of his practice and his search through it. clues to Raje's attitude to context, precedence, and continuity. If the wedding wall was an ephemeral moment, an expression of a poetic enclosure, in the Ravi Mathai Center at the IIM in Ahmedabad, which I hope continues to stand after all the sort of efforts that are going on currently, we also see this focus on human gathering expressed through a sense of boundedness. It is designed, like the wedding wall, to accommodate in the spirit of agreement in order to constitute a whole. This is just the site. The white is the part that Khan was involved in up to 74. The gray part was continued by Raje and Doshi in the Doshi-Raje partnership. And you see the Ravi Mathai Center in the bottom right corner. You also see the twin plazas, which is the Khan Plaza and the Ravi Mathai Plaza, reminiscent of medieval towns with their royal or church square, which is more formal, and the market square, that is the more relaxed sort of square. There are several versions of the program, as is typical with incremental growth within an educational campus, but eventually the design of the RMC consisted of an auditorium of about 750 people and supporting administrative offices for the entire academic complex. Now, because we are, like we were in conversation with Corbusier, we are in conversation with Khan here, a little bit about, much has been made in the scholarship of Khan, especially, of his achievements in restoring the power of the axis. And here you have, of course, Salk Institute at La Jolla, the IIM, of course. Now, Michael Lewis, in a lecture he delivered in 2017, actually on a wonderful occasion where there was this huge Khan retrospective called Louis Kahn, The Power of Architecture. And this particular exhibition where his lecture was actually housed within the Kimbell Art Museum, which is a wonderful meta moment. But anyway, Michael Lewis proposed an alternative reading on Kahn's most significant accomplishment in bringing life back to a modernism that had become formulaic. And I find that this particularly sort of significant in sort of continuing to Raje's interventions in the IIM. So when we look at modern architecture, and of course I simplify here for the sake of the lecture, we see that it had conceived a new kind of space. Here is the Crown Hall, if some of you aren't familiar, at the IIT in the US, Indian Illinois Institute of Technology, where Mies van der Rohe creates this heroic roof truss, a kind of exoskeleton holding the roof aloft, so that the interior has no partitions whatsoever. We don't have rooms, we don't have walls. All we have is space, flowing space. Mies had abolished the two elements of architecture that had been throughout architecture's history, the enclosed room and the solid wall. And what Khan did was to bring that room back. This is, of course, the central atrium at the Exeter Library. He brought back the room as the fundamental unit of architectural expression, not flowing space without shape or boundaries, but a fixed and poetic enclosure. And with Raje, this room begins to meet the tropics, the hot and dry tropics of the region he practiced and lived in once he returned from Philadelphia. A room for Raje in this context, therefore, is a bounded space without a roof that is open to change and cycles of the sun and the moon, to growth and to decay. It is a simple exchange in emphasis, you see, in that it prioritizes the enclosure of context over the enclosure of merely space. That is, it makes the architecture answerable to the context rather than merely to compositions of space. This was to become an anchor for Raje. And it's making an architecture that evidences its immersion in time, where the walls that unclose, and I quote Kevin Lowe here, architecture, so where the walls that unclose, this is really his term, but I find it very, very poetic and applicable here. Architecture are the same walls that enclose this outdoor room. So it is, in other words, what we choose to call thresholds often in our vocabulary. So in the development of the Ravi Mathai Center, what we see is that notion of this outdoor room is called upon to make relationships with the existing academic complex. And you see that in these sketches, more in the exhibition, if some of you have gone there. It is important to note that the outdoor room is not a generator of form, but a way in which Raje could make a dignified locus of human activity, and through that, the plan emerges. The final plan, of course, you have the auditorium with its lobby facing the Ravi Mathai Plaza and some of the offices that we already talked about. Raje was occasionally questioned why he turned the entrance of the auditorium away from the parking, which is presumably where everyone arrives. The significance of where the Mathai Plaza was located in relation to the auditorium for Raje had to do with what happens after a performance or a lecture. Not before, when you're most likely rushing to arrive on time or anticipating the program. It is a different kind of an energy. But after a program, you're full, you're content, hopefully. And that is when you appreciate a place to linger, discuss, and appreciate fully what you have experienced. So what we see is that there are two relationships Raje initiates through this project. One, as we have already seen, the faculty courts, the relation between the plaza and the faculty courts through to the Khan Plaza, which we have already seen. And the second, a relationship between the indoor and the outdoor rooms of the Mathai Center itself. And here what we see is that the plaza, which is the outdoor room happening somewhere here, and then the indoor room of the auditorium house. But what happens is they have an equivalency. In the making of now the indoor room, we see both freedom and discipline expressed through the organization of space and material. Concrete is associated with making space, that is the indoor space, and brick is associated with making enclosures. That is the sort of final plan. A few sort of developmental studies and search for this architectural expression of that threshold of the in-between, of the unclosure. The brick enclosure at the auditorium lobby is oriented, as we've already seen, to the plaza, given the delineation of the curved lobby wall and the portico, and oriented also to the faculty offices courts and the larger context through the upper levels of the lobby. These are some sketches for the development of the concrete folded plate roof now, how he made the room of the interior. It is an element, though, designed to span, to divert water on both sides, and to perform acoustically within the space below. The concrete indoor room, further more sketches, making the auditorium, that is the formal enclosure. So what we see is it's a robust interior where the meaning of use and the means of making are overlaid. The concrete undertakes many responsibilities, as we saw earlier with the roof. A view from the inside. Now the meeting of the concrete volume and the surrounding brick enclosure becomes the aisles leading the audience to the main chamber. You are here taken through the structure within the forces and under them, much like the aisles below the flying buttresses of cathedrals. The roof and the faceted walls were designed in consultation with both the structural engineers, of course, who were Sharad Shah and Mahendra Raj as a consultant, and the acoustical engineers, so that the addition of acoustic materials could be kept to a minimum, a sculpting that is possible given that concrete is a poured material. So he was always overlaying things in that sense. So we see for Raje through the previous projects that the plan is an expression of an intention, and the intention is to give form, that is to articulate the relationships of activity, use, making, geography, all of that, these relationships that bind us. Now, this is a sketch from 1969. Sketches from the 67 to 69 periods I've found are really quite significant, because these were the later years of Raje in Philadelphia, and also overlapped with his transition back to India. He stayed for about 6 or 8 months in France. He wasn't actually quite sure he wanted to come back to India, so he stayed on. But they are sort of instructive to get a glimpse of, at that period, what is he observing, studying, and recording. So here you see a record of a chamber of light on his travels through south of France on his way back, as I said, to India. And years later, almost a decade and a half later, you see here the Management Development Center, where a chamber of light is beginning to meet the tropics through the loggia. So the light well that you saw is on the right-hand side of this picture, the loggia that is being photographed, to the garden room, the outdoor room. Again, this is just a site plan of IIM to locate where MDC was. This was where Ravi Mathai Center was. MDC and the faculty residences, basically, so these are the faculty residences. So MDC is really in the company of the faculty residences. The program is an independent post-professional program where executives already in the field come for further studies. It's, I think, like your post-developmental program or some PDP or something as it's called now. So it's a residential continuing education program. Now, although Raje's plans at first glance appear to be all about geometric compositions, when you begin to examine them really closely, you realize that they are not about shape making really, but they are compositions in terms of light and air expressed through space. These generative elements can be deciphered in the MDC through their distinct positioning, thereby giving them further resolution in terms of creating a formal vocabulary. And the order comes through the translation of these elements into construction. So that light well that you saw occurs here between the garden room and the larger indoor spaces within. So you see them, the areas of use, Raja used to say, can be manipulated, but the elements of light are at the very heart of the project, related as they are to sun and air. So you see them as light wells, as the previous photograph showed, loggias, lobbies, verandas, links, porches, etc. And these begin to then bind the rest of the plan together. A model view to, again, help you locate where those light wells were that you saw. Now, and these are certain sections. At MDC, there is also a rather interesting transformation of Khan's academic complex in terms of the formal and volumetric organization. Depressing the building into the ground makes it both contextually driven, both in terms of scale, because as we saw, it's adjacent to the residences, and therefore they are not overwhelmed, and also in terms of climate, where the larger volumes of congregation occupy the cooler subterranean spaces, as you see here. And this is, so the loggia that you saw was here, through it opens out, and the steps lead you back to a garden that then the rooms share. This is a developmental study of those, that brick enclosure that you saw in the previous photograph, but also a theme you saw in the Ravi Mathai Center. Space is what light makes with it, is what Raja used to say, and light as the architectural generator. This was also Khan's language, which we see continued with Raje. So the first architectural element at MDC is the element through light gives you pools of shadow, and with that a sense of shelter again. And finding an economy in the expression and delineation of these elements was the discipline then. Because as he used to tell us as second year students, he would always say, light is like gold dust. A little goes a long way and too much is just vulgar. So he was always trying to sort of find that balance. And therefore, light wells diffuse the sun and make the concrete luminous, and also enable the hot air to rise up and out. In this particular case, the cooler air from the basement establishes that thermal convection that keeps the air moving. And it is also, this is looking the other way, it is a junction where the world above meets the world below, marking an occasion with light which you can then inhabit. So in various sketches through his sketchbooks, you see this, the scale of light elements and the heaviness of the shadows begin to suggest activities. And therefore, we begin to see that Raje's sketches are not, generally speaking, scenic recreations of a view. They don't just describe, but they analyze and explore opportunities. You begin to see explorations bringing together activities, elements of architecture and plan making. So now we sort of come to the next part, which is what sort of generates, if you have to create opening in order to get light, what is that discipline and search? These are some sketches. This one is from Assisi in 1967 again, Rome, Santa Maria della Pace in 67 again, so he was traveling. But what we begin to see, what he's capturing through these various slides, is that he is looking at the repetition of the singular moment that sets up a sequence which integrates an occasion with light and the material between. The making of a sequence, we see, assures an edge and it begins to make an order. Further, some sketches, I think, of his 87 trip to Dhaka. These were actually in Khan's office when he was working at the Islamabad Assembly, which was never built. But what you begin to see is when you discern an order, the plan becomes legible with regards to its intentions, and that is what the architecture is a result of. This is just further another project he was working on at Khan's office. This is, I think, the Interama in Florida. Anyway, by way of that, we arrive at the Galba Bhai. So from the singular courts of MDC and the Mathai Center, here we have the Galba Bhai's Farmers Training Institute. This is an institute for dairy farmers located in North Gujarat, which is essentially dairy land in Gujarat. Now I'm going to take you through a series of these developmental sketches where we see that the bounding walls make both the interior and outdoor rooms, that is the classroom block. Here, Raje seems to be testing distinctions. The relationships between the outside and the inside are not established by erasing lines, the proverbial blurring that we hear so often, but instead it becomes a question of drawing the right lines, and the architecture begins when these lines begin to relate rather than separate. So through that, a plan is generated. So if we look at the plan, the place of introduction comes first, which is this. Entry comes next, which is, so place of introduction and entry, and then the door in a formal way. These are overlays that begin to suggest a place and allows architecture to elevate the function of an entrance to a ceremony. So before you even come to the classrooms, you've gone through an entire sequence of various sorts of outdoor rooms that suggest through their scale and position and relation to the preceding and succeeding rooms, the manner and the kind of the nature of assembly. And then even from there, the two classrooms back into a enclosed garden that in a way takes you back to where you began, and yet you can't literally go there. It is just hinted. This is the physical solution in terms of the model. The outdoor rooms, which we sort of went through, of which there are several explorations, as we saw, through their various spatial organization and order of geometry, are held into a harmonious whole, reconstituting the context and reframing the terms of enclosure. It's actually a remarkably sophisticated project given the modesty of the situation. This is the siting and character, of course, when it was built. Now it is sort of, it's transformed, it's sort of inverted. It's now a very inward-facing institution, because everywhere you see fields, there are now factories, but this little thing still holds. It's, yeah, what you basically see here is rough cut stone, because that is what was available, and a fairly rough and rustic concrete, because that is the kind of formwork that was available there, or possible there in a sense. Now, in this project, we really begin to see another aspect developing. In order to develop an edge and make an opening, one needs to develop an element of span. Khan used to say brick is stingy and concrete is generous. Now in Raje's architecture, except for the brick enclosures at the IIMA, concrete is almost always called upon for spanning elements. So brick in Raje's architecture actually only did the grunt work in terms of gravity. All the sort of a work of spanning and space making was given over to concrete. To Raje, this element of span was not merely a lintel, but a logical development in how he explained it, in terms of loads, shear forces, and bending moments. The exercise then is critical and significant in order to find that it is possible to express stresses and hubs of their distribution, as you begin to see in the left-hand side series of sketches. The form then is the result of sculpting away where material is not needed, and not a motif to be employed in pattern making, or worse, a signature to establish a recognizable style or brand. Being sculpted, it is naturally able to capture shadows, bringing three-dimensionality to even the most basic of surfaces. The sloped court here, what you see between the dining and the residences, dining is to your right in this picture. The bunding walls give it form and establish the character of the project. The dining area, for instance, now from within, which is essentially a veranda, to the kitchen and the court, where the trainers and the trainees eat sitting on the floor. The walls and pilasters, as you see, are expressive of the meeting of the room and the wall edge. The pilasters begin to develop anthropomorphically, extending in the direction of the forces in order to receive them. This leads to a certain heft, a certain thickness, an agglomeration of material which can then begin to accommodate seating, etc., etc. An in-between state of affairs, though. Again, that unclosures that we were talking about. It marks the meeting, and then you have, these are just some more views. Now, we zoom into the classroom block and its porch to the two classroom wings. The porch serves as the threshold between classrooms, that is the indoor rooms, as well as to the passage between the preceding court and the garden enclosure, which upon entry reminds us of the beginning. As I said, the beginning is here somewhere. It marks the meeting of people coming out from or going into the classrooms and of structural forces, a junction which through its multiple overlays, in a different way from what we saw at Ravi Mathai and what concrete was doing there, it is a junction through its multiple overlays materialized, establishes the sense of place and that of a dignified locus. In terms of the western edge of the institute, made up of 2 stories of residential rooms, here the lintel transforms now into an element in its own right, a distinct entity, which in our climate is a shadow pocket within which somewhere there is a small opening to the interior room. Much like the ceremony of arrival, therefore, Raje seems to be suggesting that there is a ceremony to making a window, and to a window itself. The articulation maintains its roots in the structural behavior in terms of bearing and stiffness, and the design language is one where the simple frame is turned on the face into a membrane, a concrete membrane barely 150 mm thick, into which openings are cut out. Now further, this sketch basically shows further development of this design and span making vocabulary, extending the lessons of Galbabhai into projects that followed, such as the IIFM, the Indian Institute of Forest Management in Bhopal. We are reminded here that whereas presentations are gregarious and are performed sometimes for effect, exploration is private and is experienced for discoveries. And an act of presentation often denies exploration. The same attitude we observe in Raje's work in his attitude to making. Structural expressionism, therefore, is not for its own sake to demonstrate some sort of expertise. It is part of exploring ways in which the meaning of use and the means of making can overlap to create a richness and relevance to the architectural experience. Now, these sketches take the previous sketch further. They show further refinement of what were to become the pavilions at the IIFM. The sketch is defined both by what is being studied and by the relationship between its being a hand drawing and an act of exploration. Thinking does not happen for a sketch to be made. The sketch is thinking in process. So what we begin to see here is Raje bringing together aesthetics, vocabulary, and structure. And the structure is fully integrated with the element of light. When firmed up, these are abstractions of construction drawings. One of the panels hangs in the exhibition. These are detailed studies of the various conditions and corners being studied through plans, sections, elevations, etc. And this, of course, is the physical solution. The photograph shows the transition from the mass of geometry at the bottom to the concrete apron above, tied midway by the lintel. This is a view of the apron corner, where you see it is relieved by keeping it open, removing the material which generally encloses a corner condition because there are no forces there. In this case, further emphasizing the freedom the apron has from bearing loads that the masonry below is subjected to. The lower parts of the pavilion are related to load, as I said, as well as to the movement and circulation of people with the water. Now, Raje translates this part as being part of the plinth at the water's edge, and the materials used at the bottom express that restrictedness. The restrictedness is important to affirm the periphery, that edge of enclosure, and so that the sense of the enclosure is maintained, it doesn't flow away. And yet, by placing the pavilions at the edge of the water through reflections, you relieve that weight, at least perceptually. These are the ambiguities that Raje seems to relish, for they make up the reality of things. These are internal courts at the faculty offices, the outdoor room, an enclosed garden that accompanies seminar rooms. So the same sort of relationship of activity endures from project to project. And the library with its court in the foreground, from the bridge connecting the seminar rooms and the faculty offices to the classrooms. So we began at the water's edge. These were the pavilions that we were looking at, right? To see that the recurrence of the pavilions throughout establishes an order of transitions and of enclosing the courts. And these elements then find their positions in the overall situations, making up what became or what becomes the academic complex. This is the model where the water strip is in the foreground. This is now the site plan. What you see here is, even though the whole site is the entirety of the hill, the concentration of the built is such that the majority of the hill could be left untouched. Even in the water strip basically collects the water from the academic complex, and this is designed to percolate down the slopes of the hill, which is part of the campus. The majority of the site, which is left to itself and to rejuvenate undisturbed. And this was done in the 1980s, really. And it was an approach that was part of the Institute's area of research, linked to other methods, such as the Bradley method in Australia, among others. So it was contemporaneous to the sort of studies that were going on around the world. So that in time, the horizon beyond the water strip, which the academic complex opened out to, slowly has disappeared and is now bound in by the new vegetation, and the architecture enters another condition. And so what you have is a profound dimension to Raje's architecture. Architecture seen as a means to trace the passing of time, and the structures and surfaces find life through time leaving its trace. Here, each evening, the slate cladding catches the sun, and the silica in it begins to refract and color the architecture. And this was taken fairly when not all the vegetation had still taken hold, because it's still one of his photographs. And finally, this is a project contemporary to the forest management, bringing us a full circle back to an architecture at once intimate and infinite. Located on a hill overlooking the Bada Talab, the larger lake, this is the gas tragedy memorial in Bhopal, one of 2 or 3 versions that he had proposed but never got to build in the end. But the memorial orients itself to an epic landscape where scale is less related to size than age, being concerned with the scale of time. This is the general layout. The memorial is, the pavilion is here. It's an open chamber enclosing a grove of flowering trees that overlooks the vista and the lake that way. And is, I believe, oriented also to the Mecca, since a huge number of people who had passed away were Muslims. Water is designed again, like IIFM, to flow down the slopes, and the principally rocky surfaces of the hill then were sort of imagined that they would be covered with mosses where it would change color seasonally, the lessons that were concurrently sort of explored at the IIFM. And this is really when you actually enter that pavilion at the end of your sort of journey up this hill through the memorial, and then you're oriented through these sort of porches to the vista and the landscape. In 1969, while traveling through France, Raje wrote in his sketchbook, "In building, there must be something unfathomable. Call it a point of reference to fathom other things. In these things too, if one thing is unfathomable, other things take their respective positions around this point of reference, and so on to infinity," he says. In Raje's work, I hope, through the past few projects that we've seen, the unfathomable, I argue, is not symbolic or abstract. It is rooted in the material and its making. The biography of construction and forces are right there. And yet, it is through making that a liberation from the material is found each time. His architecture explains, yet it provokes wonder. And therefore, it is that place between the fathomable and the unfathomable. Thank you for your attention.
So while we wait for the stage to be reconfigured a little for the conversation, maybe I'll take the opportunity to share a personal anecdote. Having been an extended part of the Raje household, Shubhra's sister Gauri was my contemporary. Not many people know, maybe some of his students here in the audience probably know, Anant Raje was quite the cinephile. And I remember in high school, I was visiting the Raje residence near Law Garden, and Raje uncle, he gave us a synopsis of the movie Scarface. High school students, huh? And we watched it on a video cassette. You know, those were the days of the video cassette. So I think cinema has also been a very important part of his life. And what we're going to do now is we're going to have a conversation between Shubhra and yet another student of Raje, Soumitro Ghosh. Probably many in the audience know Soumitra and Nisha of the Matthew and Ghosh Architects fame. There are quite a few public works in Bangalore that some of you must have visited. We have the Freedom Park, the National Military Memorial, and the more recent Museum of Art and Photography, MAP. Soumitra was educated at CEPT in Ahmedabad. And interestingly, since we have an exhibition going on now, I should mention that in 1991, as the student academic secretary of CEPT, Soumitra had curated a retrospective of Raje's work as an exhibition on CEPT campus. After graduating from CEPT, Soumitra worked with B.V. Doshi, with Vasavada, with Neelkanth Chaya. I'm throwing these names out there as if all of you know them. But I'm sure some of you do. Those of you who are architects or have studied at CEPT, I see quite a few faces here who must have known Raje in some form or the other. His teaching journey, Soumitra's teaching journey began with Kumar Vyas, who was one of the founding members of the National Institute of Design, also known as NID. And Soumitra's interests lie at the intersection of politics, philosophy, culture, and history. And it sort of completes a triangle here. We all know each other. Soumitra, can I have you on stage, please?
Thank you, Shubhra, for bringing the wonderful exhibition, and thanks to the Anant Raje Foundation, and it's nice to see Amita Ben here, and BIC for making it possible. I think lots of people have been coming and enjoying seeing the drawings, although I was hoping to see two particular projects in more detail. One was the Mineral and Mines Museum, I'm sure another day, and the Bhopal gas tragedy, which is interesting because I never knew till I saw the project in the book and then the sketch here. Because Raje was on the jury when we were competing for the memorial project. And it's quite incredible. I mean, I got a bit closer to Raje because of the exhibition. And it was quite unbelievable because I was young and, you know, I was approaching Raje for everything that I could get. And generously enough, there was nothing which was left inaccessible to me. Varki was instrumental. He said, anything you need, tell me. Anything that you can't manage from the student body. So that was a good moment. I think everybody was able to see a lot of the projects. We had complete folios of working drawing blueprints in the show. Talking about Raje today, I think I want to just, because for me as an outsider, because I think an architect remains an outsider to the others, it's very difficult to kind of break that, to really get into another person's mind. I'll start with the project. I really want to know what you think. When we saw the Naval Academy, I saw the sketches, and the way the beginnings happen, they are actually on top of the hill. And to me, the map looks like a battle map, where certain things are being located at critical points, and there are routes which are being created. And here I drawn two things, actually, and these might be all conjectures. One is about Khan processed a lot of his, through his travels to Italy, to San Gimignano and other places, he processed a lot of that understanding. To me, that architecture is not only of religious buildings and palaces, but it's also of the military. To me, it is also about bastions, and it's about city walls. And that is, do you see a link, how he translates that into an architecture of a certain kind of order? And the second is about almost like Nolly, who draws a plan with only the public buildings and the important buildings and the public spaces. That's exactly how Raje starts on the Naval Academy. And he lets the rest come in later. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's the Naval Academy is quite interesting, isn't it? Because you would assume that the main academic training, administrative buildings where everyone comes together, the citadel, so to speak, which is articulated as well that way, through ramparts and through sort of circular forms, but were actually located at the bottom in the valley. And they could afford, except for the parade ground, if you see, they could afford to bring focus back onto themselves, almost strengthening the purpose of coming together. And it is the residences which in the development sketches, which are on the right-hand side, which are not even drawn, they get the hillside. And the manner in which they are organized and the way in which the paths lead to the main academic and training complexes, the collectives, are always oriented to the vista. So in a strange way, Raje, in my, these are initial studies of the Naval Academy. What I find most remarkable is that the vista is democratized, actually. They're given over to everybody because it's something that belongs, the sea and the vista belongs to the residents. And the collective forms and programs are then, therefore, you come down to then look back inward. So it's a strange relationship because on the one hand, of course, citadels were located for military purposes and defense on the tops of hills, and the minions were at the bottom. He very quietly subverts it, and I found that very powerful in that project, that without saying much. And although I found this always really remarkable about his architecture, because when you first encounter it, the strength and the conviction of forms is what strikes you. And so far, I've always seen most of the narratives, which are few anyway, around his work, always stopping at that. But there are these sort of, he was very, very particular about elevating human use and making sort of his own pointed remarks without making too big a bone of it.
Yeah, I mean, the Galbabhai Institute, I mean, it's one of the kind of a jewel of a project. And as you said, actually, Raje is very difficult to penetrate and understand, because I find that there is a certain kind of merging of construction, of an imagination of an idea, an imagination of opening it up, but yet it is seemingly very impenetrable.
Yes.
So that I find always a struggle. And if I look at, especially the Galbabhai project, two things struck me. And these may be little far-fetched in what I'm trying to draw from it. One is where his buildings are actually evolving like an animal, almost like a human being, where the appendages and the ends of the appendages are actually getting finer and more evolved, literally evolved. They're evolving. And I see that in his sketches, where he's actually evolving the arch, and it's getting finer and finer and finer. So it's like our nails, what they are today and what it was in the prehistoric man. So it's almost doing something which is what I would call as construction anatomy. It is evolving. So that I found very interesting, and that one column between the classrooms reminds me of Fatehpur Sikri in the Diwane Khas.
Yes.
And the other one might be extremely ornate and poetic, but this is no less, in my opinion. It has a much smaller scale. It draws it in another way, because there are these two classrooms and there is this little courtyard. Yeah. And there are those four beams which are literally like the four bridges.
Yes.
And The way he, the third, which is, I think, which is his huge contribution. I mean, when he comes back to the tropic, he shifts the room to the outside, and which is a huge move from Cannes.
Yeah.
It is actually putting the outside in the focus and using the buildings as the envelopes of this large room.
Yeah.
And each of these rooms, which is a building in itself, has its cells and it has its divisions, and then he starts developing the corners. So it's quite incredible. So he becomes very difficult to understand for me because there is poetry, but I just can't get at it. I know there is the poetry of light, which is there, but I just can't. It's not easy.
Yeah.
He makes it very difficult.
Yes, you have to. I believe you have to spend a lot of time, but they are interesting readings. Thanks so much for those. Galba Bhai and that column is. But again, how remarkable, right? That instead of, yes, the column in the between the two classrooms and at the center of that entire constellation, the two indoor and the two outdoor rooms, is at the heart. It's also at the heart of all the stresses and the forces. And yet, because it's not for a king, you can't occupy it. You occupy everything around it. So, I mean, talking about poetry, these are sort of, but we don't have to find poetry in that sense. It's, but they are, I mean, because it's through drawings that you begin to discover, like layers of an onion. Once you begin to follow a sort of the logic of something, and then you begin to see, oh, that is overlaid then with circulation, that is overlaid then with its position in plan and its relationship with other activities. It's the overlays that begin to give hints of the poetics involved. But then it's kind of for you to discover it. So you have to sort of study it. It's never apparent. But when you do, something is revealed, which is quite interesting. But I loved hearing your interpretations. Thank you.
When I looked at the MDC, I actually stayed there, I think, twice or thrice, because I think I was doing something at Sept, and I was...
And the Khansama there was very good. The dining halls.
So, they are really monastic rooms, and but I think it's one of the most intensely magical projects. Two things which come to mind. One is the way you spoke about it, how he sort of, from the courtyard to the harsh light of the outside, he literally layers it. And I remember in 2016, I think Indian Architect and Builder had asked me to write a piece on the building. And I think I wrote about, sorry, I have to check exactly what it was. Sorry, there's too many notes. I wrote, darkness is a shade of light. And the second thing which I discovered was about the interchangeable nature of density, which is the density of material and the density of light, which I find especially magical in the passage between the courtyard and the core, where the light is rediscovered inside. It is, and this is something which is also very easy to say or talk about, how Raje actually managed this with a very strong geometric order of things. It was actually all very intuitive, but yet it seems so precise,
Yes,
and you can't believe that with precision can we have this magic happening.
Yeah. Some would say because of that precision it happens, but it's caught in that space between.
Yeah, and the second thing he does in the courtyard, which is almost like a courtyard of a basilica, the flooring pattern is no different. It is just a modification of that.
Yeah.
So I think it also communicates in a different way. And this is way before anybody could imagine that Raje did this with that flooring, is that because it's perhaps in his mind in the background, and the pattern with the concrete strips and broken into rectangles and the brick pattern, it is extremely basic with the most frugal of materials. And as you talked about light, when he talked about light as gold dust, that frugality was to be treasured, and it was closer to the essential.
Yes.
And that anything in excess would take you away.
Yes. Yeah, he used to, I think somewhere else he has said, that otherwise it becomes like a forest fire, very difficult for you to then find control and keep things held in composition. Yeah. Yeah, very true. So, no, I'm enjoying sort of listening to your interpretations as well. And
no, I think we'll open it up, but I just wanted to talk about one of my favorite projects, which is the IIFM, and of course the Bhopal Crash Tragedy Memorial, which is quite incredible because it actually does something which, however big you do, you cannot. The limitlessness of the void. And that's something which is incredible. And this idea of the forest. And that's one thing I wanted to ask you about Raje's gardens.
Uh-huh.
There is a very strong grid of, presenting, other than the Galbabhai, where there is a pocket of bougainvillea, there is a pocket of a grid of trees. I have not been very clear about why it is a grid of trees in general. He does talk about it in one place in the book which you and Amita Ben have written, which is, he talks about it, a cluster of trees, as being a larger body, although they are composed of, let's say, number of trees. But I have never been clear about why. Why a grid?
Perhaps my mother can correct me, but I remember as a student, so this is where I can sort of go back to, but he always used to say that, first of all, there was a distinction, which again is conveyed and expressed at the IIFM, that there is what man built and then there is what man left alone for nature to regain and retake. And where man built, every material he used was in the service of that architecture and that order. And trees and vegetation for him were as architectural. You see that in notes as well. I think there are a couple of sketches in the exhibition where there's one panorama, or rather two-page sketch, where he's basically sketching various species of trees and noting their spatial sort of potentials. So rows of palm trees suggest one kind of space. Neem trees or generous shade and canopy trees, another type. Vegetation where canopies are at your shoulder height is another kind. So they were as much architectural elements, and those that came within your composition were to be treated with that sort of attention and care as you would with brick or concrete. And then as you began to then leave those parts to nature, then that takes over. And I think in that sense, landscape was not ornamental. It was merely an extension of the order that he was already establishing, and normally to do with the sense or the ceremony of arrivals or departures, the ceremonies of congregation. And so in general, where he dealt, I think, at least in the projects that I've been studying, where he dealt with landscape was again in ways to lend some sort of grace to a gathering or a sense of arrival or even waiting to depart. And so, yeah.
Yeah, on an anecdotal front about the IIFM, we were studying it for the NASA competition during the student days. Chaya was guiding us, and at that time the security was not very much on campus. So we actually spent the night inside without them knowing. And so we saw the sunrise and the sunset. And I'll send you better pictures. It was blazing. It was on fire. Those pavilions were literally on fire. And and that project actually makes a huge shift, in my opinion, of or understanding of what he does with, with the order of. There is, of course, certain similarity with the kind of, disposition of things, and then how perhaps he's little more. I think there is a much stronger fluency in this project, where he's pulling and pushing with great ease. But what he does in the bigger picture is that he's actually opening up these courtyards and to these pavilions. And the pavilions are absolutely gorgeous because, to me, they remind me of fallen spires. It's the void of the spire. They're beyond the circle, and that is actually something to allude to. Speaking about architecture and time, which you spoke about, and the idea of decay, which you already embed into the project, and you bring it to what was in the center of Salk Institute is moved to the edge completely, and it literally becomes a river. And it becomes like Maheshwar and like Ujjain from the similar area, and the structures one can talk about Mandu and may have some impact. But the presence of the river and the making of the edge is very much like the Ghats, and his work with the horizon, which you talk about, which is, you could see the whole city when it was just finished at that time, and one could see the whole city, and now I think it's a full forest.
Yes.
So it's about this side of knowing that I'm on this side of the river. And on the other side of the river was always the forest and the unknown.
Yeah.
So I think the parallels were so strong, and they actually reappear in Gautam Bhatia's scheme for the NGMA, which is about the Ghats, and it's, of course, and it's a large curve, and it appears. And I had seen that exhibition when it was held. It is just, I think that is one of the most successful. It creates a huge mythology, which is actually a microcosm of a very large civilization or a city, you know. So I think that really captures so beautifully the...
Yeah, and this whole thing about the village and the forest, the man-made and what is left to nature. Yeah.
Yeah, the water is, and the water, because it moves with the breeze and with the little movement, it actually blurs the pavilions, which is there in your picture as well, which makes it as if you are seeing it from a distance and that it may or may not be real.
Yeah.
So I think it has great poetry, which we find it so difficult in practice to, and it all comes from the plan, which is quite, so incredible.
Yes, yeah. It starts from there, absolutely. Yeah. They were all his photographs, by the way, because that's the other incredible thing about the practice. That
he never had anybody photograph, right?
No, because I suppose we've talked about it often. I think that it's also an opportunity to self-reflect and examine what one has done now that it is materially expressed, and so to be immersed even at that stage, to constantly use it as a source of reflection. And I think that's what we are trying to do with those contact sheet series, that you're seeing, rather than one photograph again, you're seeing a person work through images, not to see what looks good, but to sort of continue the thought process of what is being made and what is yet to be made, I suppose.
Great. I think we'll open the floor to for comments, questions.
I might be curious to hear your thoughts on the rigor of his hand was so great. How would he have reacted to be working today in the era of digital production?
Well, I think, I mean, so obviously I can't speak for him, but I remember conversations in the 2000s. I wasn't here, so these were primarily phone conversations and correspondences. He had a curiosity, of course. He was trying to figure out at that stage both the opportunities and the limits of using your hand in a different way, basically, whether suddenly the hand-eye mind connection that is with your pencil is given over through the mouse and mediation to something else. I know he was trying to figure it out, but honestly, Prem, that's the extent of what I can contribute to your, or extend your question. It would be, I suppose, too reductive to say, oh, he was a bit nervous about it. I believe he would print out every email to read it, so he needed something tangible. So these are anecdotes, I suppose. But I would like to believe, because he loved being with students and he loved learning, rather than embrace it uncritically in his own way. I don't think he would have used this word, criticality, but he was thinking about constantly, with every new thing, where the limitations lay and where certain opportunities may or may not have been. I wish I could say something further, quite honestly. But yeah, I think the hand drawing was an extension, definitely, of the mind. And that was I mean, won't you say? That was sort of...
Having taught studios with him, many of the European students, exchange students, came with computer screens. He wouldn't negate them, but he would say, don't begin with a computer. Bring it at the last stage, when you have to do the drawing fast, when you've already resolved what is kind of fuzzy in your mind in the beginning, and then resolve it first and then take to the computer. That's how far he went, because he never used a computer. So many times there were discussions between two generations that Shubhra knew more about how to use the computer than he did. So he would say, well, you can't poche and smudge when you are not sure on computer. And she said, well, there are ways to do it, you may find ways to do it. So it stopped at that, And the other thing he felt about computers was that there is only one size of the screen. You have to cut if the concept involves a larger scale, which you don't want to really minimize to an extent that it becomes an insect instead of a human being. So he says you have to cut that whole thing into pieces of the screen size. So the machine dictates your overall thinking. And that's where it stopped, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah. So in our office, there was never a computer. Yeah.
But I think what I'm more curious about is, because I see a whole lot of sort of young architects and students in the audiences, always whether something, a curiosity at least, or a question is rekindled in terms of what might the hand do even now alongside computers, whether drawings such as what are exhibited, whether they ignite or rekindle in some way the possibilities that it seems we have just sort of given up on the potential of what the hand and mind together can still do. I'm just curious about that in general. Yes, Vijay.
Thank you. What can I say? First and foremost, I have to say that Raje was a friend. I'd known him for many, many, many years as a friend, a good friend. And I'd like to say something about that friendship which might help explain some of the perplexity that you shared with us. It might not. But first I'm going to ask Amita to please stand so the audience can see you. Please, just stand for even half a minute. There she is, that's Amita. You heard the name, now you see her. I knew Amita before I knew Raje. In my Ahmedabad days, I knew Amita, I knew her family. Raje came a little later. And of course, when he came, he took her away. But I got to know Raje almost immediately after he arrived, because it was a small circle in Ahmedabad. And there was a lot of exchange across institutions in the same geographical area, the Institute of Management, the Textile Research Institute, the Physical Research Laboratory, and the Education Society, and so on. And in fact, Raje was given a one-bedroom dig next to our campus. And we met often. Now, almost immediately after that, a small circle of friends emerged. We were completely different in our professional pursuits, but we had an intellectual curiosity about learning other disciplines, about each other's work. So we created what was called an Athenaeum. And we'd meet roughly once a month, and people could talk about anything other than their own professions. All right? I'm saying this because you discovered another Raje then. And I can say with some confidence that he was an architect, almost incidentally, but he was an anthropologist. And you saw the anthropologist in a lot of his work, in a lot of what he taught, because I used to go to the School of Architecture as a visitor, and I'd watch him. So I thought he was instinctually an architect, an anthropologist. Plus, he had great ecological sensitivity. He would more than once, I've heard him more than once talking about how mankind is the only species in the entire planet that takes more than give back to nature. It's the only species that has this lopsided balance in the give and take. One of the most stimulating evenings in that Athenaeum was a talk and discussion on the concept of structure. not structure purely in architecture terms, but what does structure mean in biology? What does structure mean in physics? In liquid crystallography? What does structure mean in social psychology? So it was a wonderful evening of exploring the concept of structure, and out of that came some wonderful experiences among all of us of understanding function and dysfunction. The idea of structure being related to function or dysfunction came out of that discussion. I'm saying this simply to underline the fact that I'd still like to hold that Raje was much, much, much more than an architect. He had such breadth of interest and such breadth of understanding. And I think that's very central, that was very central to his life and therefore central to his work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful things that we did not know and will help us appreciate. Yeah, I remember there was one lecture in the pre-mobile days, so nothing was recorded. It was on the SEPT campus, and Raje was talking about the Kimball Art Museum, and in all these 5 decades plus of my existence, it would be within the top 5. Because he spoke about structure, he spoke about poetry, he spoke about light, and it was absolutely seamless. Because I think that's the way he saw it. That's the way he lived it, that it was all very seamless and getting translated into something which gets frozen as architecture. But yeah, one of the most incredible lectures. And it was very, it was impossible to separate a single strand of what he was saying. You know, it was just not possible.
Can I ask one more? Sorry. I just want to share an observation and then perhaps you can comment. Having known Raje personally, not well, but having had several discussions with him. And at least in those discussions I had, he never spoke about his buildings directly. He would speak about the process, he would speak about issues, and of course, as Vijay has pointed out, he could speak with great depth and knowledge on many issues beyond architecture. And I thought about that, and the rigor of his resolution, again, was so strong that eventually in the building there was no further explanation needed. So they're really to be just seen in silence. And then it struck me that monastic silence was very strong in his method, in his working. And somehow in his teaching, he was able to bring that across. But sadly, that's one of the things that's most missing in today's world. There's always an attempt to sort of fill the silence with something. And perhaps we need to sort of emphasize the importance of silence as a mode of discovery.
Yes, I apologize in that case for putting a whole lot of sound in the architecture. But you're very right. Yeah, absolutely.
And just add to what Prem you pointed out. I think because as I saw it over the last 3 days, of course, I was trying to absorb more and more. Also, Raje was taking the core of his project outside the buildings. So it was not so much about his buildings at all, actually. He was talking about something else altogether. And that requires enormous courage and enormous humility. So that's something which is what you're talking about, is quite incredible.
Yeah.
Hi. Good evening. Thank you so much for flying down in the wonderful talk. So since a couple of the themes in the discussion seem to be around interpretation and feedback, I just had a couple of questions around that. So was Rajesh sir ever someone who, because you spoke about the photos that he'd take when the projects were done, was he someone who was self-critical of his work, even after the projects were done, or was he someone who just said, once it's done, it's, for the audience to kind of figure out the feedback and everything else? So that was the first thing. The second thing is, just wanted to know his thoughts about formal training for architects. I believe a lot of the people he looked up to were not formally trained as architects, like Van der Rohe and Frank Lloyd and everyone. So, I believe he advocated for a stronger institutional, architectural kind of framework for younger architects in India. Just correct me if I get the nuance wrong, but this is something I read. So.
So your first question was about
Self-critical or yeah.
I think it was absolutely part of his practice, but the self-reflection was done in private in that sense. The buildings were offered up to the clients and the life that it would take on, except for the IIM projects, because the nature was different. He was sort of on the campus in some way, so that relationship was a little different. But definitely, because his search never wavered in the sense with trends and styles, etc., every project was a way to constantly be refining things he was searching for. So in that sense, every method available was used to continue that self-examination, self-reflection. Very big words, but simply it was a very immersive sort of a life in that sense. No? So, yeah, it was central. And therefore, I suppose, he didn't publish much unless somebody actually asked. Similarly, never sort of appreciated photography, but chose to, as far as his work was concerned, the photography was part of his tool to continue examination and explorations. Yeah. Yeah. And the other one was?
Was around the dichotomy of formal training versus, being that generalist kind of a...
I only know anecdotally, since I was also away a lot of times, but to recall through conversations, whenever he was asked to sort of... I suppose he was ambivalent in the sense that when asked to sort of talk about teaching methods and pedagogies, he would simply say that what he taught was an extension of his practice, and he believed all teaching should be such. So he was very ambivalent about what he did to be reduced to a method that then could be fed or taught to other teachers, that each teacher must discover how he wants to engage with students based on what his or her practice is. Again, this is anecdotal, so, but yes.
But thank you so much.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for, I hope you enjoyed seeing the exhibition as well, and it's on till the 25th, so do catch it and yeah, spend some time with the exhibits. Thank you, Shubhra, thank you, Amita, and thank you to BIC and Mad Salon. Thanks for bringing it here.
Thank you.